You really should have checked who owns this land before calling the cops. The smell of hot asphalt hit me before I even opened my truck door, thick and bitter under the late Texas sun, mixing with the sharp scent of fresh-cut grass from the identical lawns lining the street. And then came the lights, red and blue flashing across my windshield like a warning I already saw coming. 2 squad cars rolling in slow, deliberate, tires crunching over gravel that wasn't theirs to touch, doors slamming one after another. Heavy, official, final, and I just stood there at the edge of my driveway, hands resting on the warm metal of my truck, watching it unfold like a scene I'd already read the ending to. Because behind those officers, stepping out like she was directing the whole operation, was Melissa Grant, white blazer, perfect posture, that same tight smile she wore every time she thought she had someone cornered, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the kind that said she believed every inch of this neighborhood belonged to her, and she pointed straight at me before the officers even reached the curb, her voice cutting through the air like she'd rehearsed it, calm, controlled, just loud enough for the neighbors peeking through blinds to hear. That's him. He's been trespassing and refusing HOA compliance, and I could feel the weight of every window watching, every curtain slightly parted, every phone probably already out recording, because in places like this, people don't miss a show, especially not one where someone's about to get put in their place. And one of the officers, tall, mid-40s, the kind of guy who's seen enough to stay neutral, walked up with that measured pace, not aggressive, not friendly, just procedural, his boots pressing into gravel that shifted under him like it didn't quite recognize the authority. And he looked at me, then at her, then back at me, and asked, "Sir, we've had a report you're refusing to comply with HOA regulations and occupying property without authorization." And I let out a slow breath, tasting dust and heat, and something almost metallic at the back of my throat. Because this wasn't new. Not really. It had been building for weeks. Every letter, every fine slipped into my mailbox like a quiet threat. Every knock on my door that came with that same polite but condescending tone. Every time Melissa showed up with a clipboard like she was enforcing federal law instead of neighborhood preferences. And I'd said the same thing every single time. Calm, steady, never raising my voice. "I'm not part of your HOA." But she never liked that answer. Not once. Because people like Melissa don't handle exceptions well. They don't like gaps in their control. They don't like being told no. Especially not by someone who doesn't fit into their neat little system of rules and approvals. And I could still remember the first time she came over, heels clicking against my driveway like she was stepping onto a stage, introducing herself as HOA president before even asking my name, handing me a printed packet of regulations like it was some kind of welcome gift, and the way her smile tightened just a little when I handed it back and said I didn't need it, that my property wasn't governed by their association. That was the moment something shifted. I saw it in her eyes, that quick calculation, that refusal to accept reality if it didn't match her authority. And from that point on, everything escalated. Letters turned into certified notices, notices turned into fines, fines turned into threats of legal action. And now here we were, police cars idling in front of my house like this was some kind of crime scene, and the officer waited, pen ready, watching me for a response, while Melissa stood just behind him, arms crossed now, confident, almost satisfied, like she'd finally pushed things far enough to force compliance. And I nodded once, slow, deliberate, my hand sliding into the cab of my truck where that folder had been sitting for weeks, untouched, waiting, because I knew this moment would come. I just didn't expect her to rush it this quickly. And as I pulled it out, thin, unremarkable, nothing flashy, just paper and ink and signatures that carried more weight than anything she could say, I caught the slightest flicker of confusion on her face, like she realized she might have skipped a step, like maybe, just maybe, she'd assumed too much, and I held the folder at my side for a second longer than necessary, letting the silence stretch, letting the sound of the idling engines and distant sprinklers fill the space between us, because moments like this aren't about volume, they're about timing. And something in the air shifted just enough for me to notice, like the whole street was holding its breath, waiting to see which version of the story was about to win. And I finally looked back at the officer, meeting his eyes, steady, calm, and said, "You might want to take a closer look at this before deciding anything." Because something told me this wasn't going to go the way she expected. The officer took the folder from my hand, fingers brushing the edge like he expected something routine, maybe a utility bill or a driver license copy. Something simple that would wrap this whole situation up in a few minutes. And for a second, everything felt quiet in that strange way it does right before something shifts. The distant hum of lawn sprinklers ticking across perfectly measured grass. The faint buzz of a golf cart somewhere down the street. Even the idling engines of the patrol cars seemed to fade into the background as he opened it, flipping past the first page. Then the second, his brow tightening just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but I saw it, because I had been watching people read those same documents for weeks now. And it always started the same way. That small pause. That moment where the assumptions in their head did not quite line up with what was printed in front of them and behind him. Melissa shifted her weight, impatient, arms still crossed, her heels clicking once against the pavement like she was trying to remind everyone she was still in control of the situation. "Officer, he has been ignoring multiple violation notices," she said, her voice smooth but sharper now, like she needed to push the narrative back into place before it slipped. "We have documentation, fines, everything. He is not authorized to be here." And I could hear the emphasis she put on that last word. Authorized, like she believed it carried more weight than it actually did, like she had built her entire sense of authority around it. And the officer did not respond right away, just kept reading, turning another page, then another, slower this time, more careful. And the second officer, younger, standing a few steps back, leaned in just enough to catch a glimpse, curiosity replacing that earlier confidence they had both walked up with. And I let the silence stretch again, because silence does something to people when they expect resistance and do not get it. It makes them fill the gap with their own doubts, and I could see it happening, not just with the officers, but with the neighbors too. A few more curtains shifting, someone stepping out onto a porch pretending to check their mail while watching everything unfold. And Melissa noticed it as well. I saw her chin lift slightly, that practiced composure tightening as she took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound more personal, more persuasive. "This property is part of Willowbrook Estates. Everyone here follows the same rules," she said, like repeating it would make it true, like saying it out loud could override whatever was written on those pages. And that was the thing about people like her. They relied on repetition, on confidence, on the assumption that no one would ever question the system they controlled. And for a long time, no one had. Because most people just wanted quiet, predictable, safe. They did not want to dig into county records or question zoning maps or trace ownership lines back decades. They just signed what they were handed and paid what they were told. And Melissa had built her entire authority on that kind of compliance, on the idea that nobody would ever look deeper, but I had. And I kept looking at her now as the officer finally stopped turning pages, his thumb resting on a document near the back, the one that mattered, the one that changed everything. And he looked up at me again. Not the same neutral expression as before, something else now, measured, cautious, like he was recalibrating, and he asked, slower this time, "Sir, can you confirm your name for the record?" And I nodded once, steady. Ethan Caldwell, letting it sit there, letting him connect it to what he was reading, because names matter when they are tied to signatures, to deeds, to filings that stretch back further than any HOA charter, and I watched his eyes flick back down to the page, then over to the second officer, a quick glance that said more than any words, and Melissa caught it too. I saw the first real crack in her expression, not fear, not yet, but confusion, like something had just slipped outside her control in a way she could not immediately explain, and she stepped forward again, this time a little faster, the composure thinning at the edges. "What is the issue, officer?" she asked, her tone tightening despite her effort to keep it smooth. And he closed the folder halfway, not fully, just enough to mark his place. And there was a pause, a longer one this time, heavy in the heat, and I could feel the shift settling in, quiet but undeniable, like a line had just been crossed that could not be stepped back over. And Melissa was still waiting for an answer she was not going to like. The officer finally spoke, and his voice had changed just enough for everyone to notice. No longer casual, no longer assuming anything. "Ma'am, I need you to step back for a moment." And it was subtle, but it landed like a crack through glass, because Melissa did not step back, not at first. She just blinked, that smile freezing in place as if her brain needed a second to catch up to what he had just said. And I watched it happen in real time. The shift from absolute confidence to something less certain, something that did not quite have a name yet. And the officer turned slightly, angling the folder so the second officer could see it clearly, tapping one specific line with his finger, slow and deliberate. And the younger officer leaned in, eyes narrowing as he read, then flicking up toward me again with a look that said he understood exactly what was sitting in front of them now. And behind them, Melissa let out a short, controlled breath, the kind people take when they are trying to stay composed while something slips out of their control. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly, her tone tightening despite her effort to keep it smooth. "This entire development is under HOA jurisdiction. We have all the documentation." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Because when people like her are confronted with something they did not anticipate, they do not question themselves. They double down. They repeat what they believe until it sounds like truth again. And for weeks now, that had worked for her. Every letter she sent, every fine she issued, every time she stood in my driveway with that clipboard and that tone, expecting compliance simply because she said so. And I had let it play out. Every single time, I had listened, nodded, taken the paper, and filed it away, because none of it mattered until it reached this point. Until she pushed it far enough to bring in someone who actually had to verify facts instead of just enforcing assumptions. And the officer straightened slightly, closing the folder just enough to hold it securely, his thumb still marking the page. And he looked at her again, more direct this time. "Ma'am, according to these documents, the land this subdivision is built on is privately owned," he said, each word measured, careful, like he knew exactly how this was about to land. And for a second, the entire street seemed to go still. Even the faint hum of a lawn mower somewhere in the distance cut out, like someone had flipped a switch. And Melissa's expression did not just crack this time. It shifted, her eyes narrowing, her posture stiffening, like she was recalculating everything in real time, trying to find the angle that would put her back on top. "That is not possible," she said, sharper now, less polished. "The developer transferred ownership to the association years ago." And I could hear the edge creeping into her voice, that subtle strain that comes when confidence starts to slip. And the officer did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened the folder again and turned it toward her just enough for her to see the heading, the seal, the signatures that mattered more than any HOA bylaw ever printed. And I watched her eyes move across the page, fast at first, then slower, then stopping altogether on one line. And there it was, that moment. That exact moment when everything she believed about this situation stopped making sense. When the story she had been telling herself no longer held together, and her lips parted slightly, not to speak, but like she needed air, like something inside her had just shifted in a way she could not immediately fix. And the younger officer took a small step back, giving space without even realizing it. Because something about the energy had changed. It was no longer a simple compliance issue. It was something else entirely now. Something bigger, and I could feel it too. The weight of it settling into the ground beneath our feet, into the houses, into the perfectly trimmed lawns that all looked the same, but suddenly did not feel the same at all. And Melissa straightened again, faster this time, pulling herself back together. Because people like her do not collapse in public, they adjust, they pivot, they search for a way to regain control. "Even if that were true," she said, forcing steadiness back into her voice, "he still has to follow community standards if he lives here." And that was the moment I knew she had not fully understood yet. Not really, because she was still thinking in terms of rules and compliance, still trying to apply her system to a situation where it no longer applied. And I took a small step forward, just enough to close the distance, the gravel shifting under my boots, the heat pressing down from the sun, and I could see every eye on the street fixed on us now, waiting, watching, because they all felt it too, that something was about to change in a way they could not quite predict. And I met the officer's gaze again, calm, steady, and said, "You might want to check the rest of it," because the line she had just read was only the beginning. The officer did not argue with me. He just nodded once, slow, like he already understood there was more beneath the surface, and he flipped the folder open again, this time turning past the first document Melissa had just seen, moving deeper, page by page, each one carrying more weight than the last. And I could hear the faint rustle of paper in the quiet heat, a dry, deliberate sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Like every turn of that page was peeling back another layer of something that had been hidden in plain sight for years, and the younger officer leaned in closer now. No hesitation this time, his eyes tracking each line, each signature, each stamp that confirmed what the first document had already started to suggest. And Melissa stayed where she was, but her posture had changed, the stiffness replaced by something tighter, more rigid, like she was holding herself together through sheer will. Her arms still crossed, but her fingers pressing into her sleeves. Just a little too hard, and I could see it in her face now. Not just confusion, but calculation, fast and restless, searching for a way to reframe what she had just seen into something she could control again. "What exactly are you implying here?" she said, her voice lower now, sharper, like she was trying to cut through whatever uncertainty was building. And the officer did not look at her right away. He kept reading, flipping to the next page, then the next, and I knew exactly where he was in the sequence, because I had memorized it myself. The original deed, the transfer structure, the lease agreements layered over decades, each one carefully written, carefully filed, each one reinforcing the same reality in a way that could not be easily undone. And when he finally stopped, his finger resting against the bottom of the page, he exhaled quietly, almost like he had just finished putting together a puzzle that should have been simple, but was not. And then he looked up again, this time not just at me, but at the street, at the houses, at everything around us, like he was seeing it differently now. And he said, "Ma'am, this is not an HOA ownership situation." And that was when the air shifted again, heavier this time, more final, because those words did not just challenge Melissa's authority, they dismantled it piece by piece. And she stepped forward before he could continue, quicker than before, the composure slipping just enough to show through. "That is not correct," she said, the polish in her voice cracking. "At the edges, we manage this entire community. Every homeowner here is subject to our rules." And there it was again, that reliance on management, on control, on the idea that authority comes from enforcement rather than ownership. And I could see some of the neighbors starting to move now, stepping a little closer to their driveways, drawn in by the shift in tone, by the sense that something bigger was unfolding right in front of them, something that might affect more than just me. And the officer raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to slow things down, his focus still on the documents. "Management does not equal ownership," he said, calm, steady, like he was explaining something simple that had just been overlooked for a very long time. And he turned the folder just enough so both of them could see the page he had stopped on, a diagram this time, not just text, lines and boundaries, parcels mapped out in precise detail, showing exactly how the land was divided, how it was controlled, how it was leased. And I watched Melissa's eyes move across it, slower than before, more careful, like she was trying to find something, anything, that contradicted what was right in front of her. But it was all there, clear, undeniable. And the younger officer let out a quiet breath, shaking his head just slightly, like he could not believe it had taken this long to surface. And the first officer tapped the page once, firm, final. "According to this, the association operates under a long-term lease agreement," he said, each word deliberate. "And the underlying property ownership has not been transferred." And that was the line that mattered, the one that separated control from actual authority, the one that most people never bothered to understand because they never needed to. And Melissa's lips parted again. But this time she did not speak right away, because there was nothing immediate left to say, no quick response that would restore the balance she had just lost. And for the first time since this started, she looked at me directly, not with that practiced smile, not with that controlled confidence, but with something else, something sharper, more uncertain, like she was finally trying to figure out who she was actually dealing with. And I held her gaze, calm, steady, letting her sit with that realization for just a second longer, because this was the part people always missed, the part where the story they believed about control quietly falls apart. And you could almost hear it happening, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle shift in the way everything fit together. And the officer closed the folder halfway again, his thumb still marking the page. And the silence that followed felt different now, no longer tense in the same way, but heavier, like It was waiting for the next piece to fall into place. And Melissa finally found her voice again, quieter this time, more cautious. "Then who owns it?" she asked, and that question hung there, simple, direct, but loaded with everything she had just lost. The question hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said, simple on the surface, but heavy underneath, because it was not just about ownership anymore. It was about everything Melissa had built her authority on suddenly being uncertain, and for the first time since she stepped onto my driveway. She was not the one controlling the conversation, and I did not rush to answer. I let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough for the weight of it to settle in, long enough for everyone watching to feel that something had shifted in a way they could not ignore. And the officer glanced at me again, waiting, not impatient, just aware that the next words mattered, and I could feel the heat pressing down from the sun, the faint smell of dry grass and pavement mixing in the air, the quiet hum of a neighborhood that had stopped pretending this was just another minor dispute. And I finally spoke, calm, steady. "I do." And it was not loud. It did not need to be. Because the reaction was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable, the younger officer's head tilting slightly, the first officer's expression tightening just a fraction as he processed the confirmation, and Melissa did not move at all for a second, like her body had not caught up with what she had just heard. And then she let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, more like disbelief trying to sound confident. "That is not possible," she said, shaking her head once, quick, dismissive, like rejecting the idea would make it go away. "You cannot just claim ownership of an entire subdivision." And I did not interrupt her. I let her finish, because people like her always reveal more when they think they are still in control. And she continued, faster now, words coming with more urgency. "There are dozens of homeowners here. Properties have been sold. Titles have been transferred. This is a fully established community." And she gestured around us, at the rows of houses, the driveways, the manicured lawns, like the visual alone was proof enough, like existence meant ownership. And I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what she was pointing at, because she was not wrong about what she could see. She was just wrong about what it meant. And the officer opened the folder again, flipping back to the earlier pages, then forward again, connecting the pieces, and I could see it settling in for him now, not just understanding the documents individually, but understanding how they fit together. And he looked at me again, more directly this time. "Sir, you are listed here as the primary title holder for the master parcel," he said, reading it out loud now, making it real in a way that could not be ignored. And there it was, out in the open. No longer just ink on paper, but something spoken, something heard by everyone standing there. And Melissa's posture changed again, her shoulders tightening, her chin lifting slightly, but the confidence behind it was thinner now, stretched. "That does not override the association's authority," she said quickly, almost immediately, like she needed to counter it before it settled too deeply. And I could see the pattern clearly now, the way she kept reaching for the same argument, the same framework, trying to apply rules that only existed within her system to a situation that existed outside of it. And I took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough that she had to look at me instead of past me, and I kept my voice even, controlled. "Your association operates under a lease," I said, not correcting her tone, not challenging her directly, just stating the fact. And I could see it land, not fully understood yet, but enough to slow her down, enough to interrupt the rhythm she had been relying on. And the officer nodded slightly, confirming it without needing to repeat it, and the younger officer added quietly, almost to himself, "Which means the land itself was never transferred." And that was the piece that connected everything, the part that most people never think about because they never need to. And Melissa's eyes flicked between us, between the folder, between the houses behind me, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of reality at the same time, the one she had been living in and the one that was now being presented in front of her. And for a moment, just a brief moment, she did not have an immediate response, and that silence was louder than anything she had said before. And I let it sit there, because this was not about winning an argument. It was about letting the truth settle in at its own pace, letting it reshape the situation without force. And somewhere down the street, a car door closed, the sound sharp in the quiet, reminding everyone that this was still happening in real time, not just on paper, and the officer closed the folder again, holding it firmly now, no hesitation, and he looked at Melissa, then back at me, and the tone of the entire situation had shifted completely from enforcement to verification, from assumption to fact. And Melissa finally spoke again, slower this time, more careful, like each word needed to be chosen. "Then what exactly does that mean for this community?" she asked, and that was the first time she was not asserting control, not issuing a statement, but asking a question she did not already know the answer to. Her question lingered, quieter than everything that came before it. And that was the first real sign things had shifted, because Melissa Grant did not ask questions unless she had to. And I could see it in the way she held herself now, still upright, still controlled, but no longer certain, like the ground beneath her had changed shape and she had not quite found her footing again. And I let out a slow breath, tasting the dry heat in the air, feeling the weight of every eye still fixed on us, from behind windows and across driveways. And I answered her the same way I had handled everything else so far, steady, without urgency. "It means your authority only exists inside the agreement you signed." And I watched that land, not fully understood yet, but enough to slow her down even more, and the officer shifted slightly beside me, nodding once as he reopened the folder, flipping to the section that outlined the lease structure in detail, and he ran his finger along a paragraph before, reading it aloud, his voice even, deliberate. "The association is granted conditional management rights subject to compliance with the terms of the master lease agreement." And he paused there, just long enough for it to sink in, before adding, "Violation of those terms may result in revocation of said rights." And the words felt heavier spoken out loud, not just legal language on a page, but something real, something immediate, and Melissa's eyes moved back to the document, slower now, more careful, like she was seeing it for the first time even though it had been there all along, and she shook her head slightly, almost to herself. "That is standard language," she said, but there was less certainty in it now, more hesitation, like she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else, and I tilted my head just slightly, watching her. "It is," I said, "but it only works if you stay within those terms," and I did not need to say more than that, because the implication was already there, sitting in the silence between us, and I could see it start to connect for her, piece by piece, every notice she had sent, every fine she had issued, every time she had enforced rules on a property she did not actually own, all of it threading back to this moment. And the younger officer shifted his stance again, looking out at the street, at the houses, at the people watching, like he was starting to understand how much of this extended beyond just one complaint. And the first officer closed the folder halfway again, holding it firmly, his expression now fully focused, no trace of that earlier assumption left. And he looked at Melissa directly. "Ma'am, if what is being presented here is accurate, then enforcement actions outside the scope of that agreement could be considered invalid," he said, his tone still calm, but now carrying a weight that had not been there before, and Melissa's lips pressed together tightly, her jaw setting for just a second as she absorbed that. And I could see the calculation returning, but different now, not about asserting control, but about assessing risk, about understanding what this meant for her position, for the association, for everything she had been enforcing up until now. And she took a small step back without realizing it, her heel catching slightly against the edge of the pavement, a subtle shift, but enough to show the balance had changed, and the neighborhood around us felt different too, quieter in a more aware way, like people were no longer just watching a dispute, but realizing they were part of something larger, something that might affect them directly. And I let the silence settle again, not pushing, not pressing, just allowing the weight of it to do its work, because this was never about confrontation, it was about clarity, about letting the facts speak for themselves in a way that could not be ignored. And Melissa finally looked back at me, really looked this time, not at the situation, not at the officers, but at me, like she was trying to understand how she had missed this, how she had let it get this far without knowing. And there was a question in her eyes now, not spoken yet, but forming, something deeper than the one she had asked before, and I could see it coming before she even opened her mouth. The next realization beginning to take shape, and something told me she was about to ask the one thing she should have asked from the very beginning. She did not ask it right away, but I could see it forming, the way her eyes narrowed just slightly, The way her focus shifted from the documents to me, like she was finally trying to solve the right problem instead of forcing the wrong answer. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter, more controlled, but no longer confident. "Then why have you been letting this happen?" she said. And that was the moment everything aligned. Because that question was not about authority anymore. It was about timing, about intent, about understanding that none of this had been accidental. And I let a small pause settle before answering, just long enough for the weight of it to register. "Because you needed to show me exactly how far you were willing to go," I said, calm, steady, and the words landed differently than anything before them. Not confrontational, not aggressive, just precise. And I watched the realization start to take shape in her expression, slow but undeniable, like a pattern finally revealing itself. And the officer beside me shifted his stance slightly, glancing between us, sensing the change in tone, the shift from explanation to something more deliberate. And Melissa's composure tightened again, but it was not the same confidence as before. It was controlled now, guarded. "We were enforcing community standards," she said. But even as she spoke, there was hesitation, like she knew the argument no longer held the same weight. And I nodded once, acknowledging it without agreeing. "You were enforcing them on property you do not own, outside the scope of your agreement," I said, keeping my voice even, not raising it, not pressing, just placing the fact where it could not be ignored. And the officer reopened the folder again, flipping to another section, one that had not been mentioned yet. And I could see his eyes tracking a specific clause, his expression tightening slightly as he read. And he looked up at Melissa. "Ma'am, there are also provisions here regarding unauthorized enforcement actions and misrepresentation of authority," he said, his tone still measured but now carrying a different kind of weight, one that did not need emphasis to be understood. And Melissa's lips pressed together, her gaze dropping to the document for just a second before returning to me, sharper now, searching. "Are you saying this entire time?" she started, then stopped, like she was recalculating mid-sentence, and I did not interrupt. I let her finish the thought in her own way, because that was where the realization would come from, not from anything I said, but from what she finally understood herself. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. "You knew," she said, not asking this time, stating it. And I met her gaze without hesitation. "From the first letter," I replied, and there was no need to elaborate, because everything else followed from that. Every notice she had sent, every fine she had issued, every time she had stepped onto my property with that assumption of authority, all of it had been documented, recorded, preserved, and I could see it connecting for her now, not just the legal side, but the pattern, the escalation, the way she had built her case without realizing it was being built against her. And the younger officer shifted again, glancing toward the street where more people had gathered now, standing at the edges of their driveways, no longer pretending they were not watching. And the atmosphere had changed completely, no longer tense in the same way, but heavier, more aware, like everyone understood something important had just come into focus. And Melissa looked around briefly, taking it in, then back at me, and there was something different in her expression. Now, not just uncertainty, but a hint of something else, something closer to concern, like she was beginning to grasp the full scope of what this meant. And she straightened slightly, pulling what remained of her composure back into place. But it did not carry the same authority as before. It felt thinner now, more fragile. "Then what are you planning to do?" she asked, and this time there was no attempt to control the answer, no assumption of what it might be, just a question she needed answered. And I did not respond immediately, because that was not a question you answered quickly, not after everything that had just unfolded. And the officer beside me closed the folder again, holding it steady, waiting, and the silence that followed felt different from all the others, not uncertain, not tense, but expectant, like the next words would not just explain the situation, they would define what came after. And I could feel every eye on me now, every neighbor, every officer, even Melissa, all waiting for the same thing. And I let out a slow breath, feeling the heat, the stillness, the weight of everything settling into place, because this was the point where everything shifted from understanding to consequence, and I knew exactly what came next. The silence stretched just long enough to make every sound sharper, the ticking of a cooling engine, the faint rustle of leaves, the low murmur of neighbors no longer pretending not to watch, and I finally lifted my head slightly, meeting Melissa's gaze without any urgency. Because this was never about speed, it was about precision. "I am going to enforce the agreement," I said, calm and even, and for a second, it sounded almost simple, almost harmless, but the reaction told a different story. Her eyes narrowing, her posture tightening again, not with confidence this time, but with something closer to concern, because she understood enough now to know that enforcement, coming from me, did not mean what it used to when it came from her, and the officer beside me shifted his weight slightly, glancing at the folder in his hands, then back at me. "What exactly does that involve?" he asked, not challenging, just clarifying. And I nodded once, acknowledging the question. "It means reviewing every action taken under the association's authority and determining whether it complied with the lease terms," I said, keeping it measured, factual, and I could see the younger officer's expression change again, a subtle tightening, like he was starting to see the scale of what that actually meant, and Melissa let out a slow breath, her composure pulling itself tighter. "That is a routine administrative process," she said quickly, but the edge in her voice gave it away, and I shook my head. Slightly. Not dismissive, just correcting. "It is only routine if everything was done correctly," I said, and that was the line that shifted things again, because it forced the question neither of them had asked out loud yet. What if it was not? And the officer opened the folder once more, flipping to the section he had paused on earlier, and I watched his eyes scan the clauses again, more carefully this time. And he spoke, slower now. "There are provisions here for financial penalties, suspension of management rights, and potential termination of the lease if violations are confirmed." And the words landed heavier than anything before them. Not dramatic, not raised, but final in a way that did not need emphasis, and I could feel it ripple outward, not just between us but across the street, into the people watching, into the houses themselves. Like the entire neighborhood had just shifted from something stable into something uncertain, and Melissa's face changed again, the confidence now fully replaced by calculation, her eyes moving quickly, connecting pieces, measuring consequences, and for the first time since this started, she did not speak immediately, because there was no simple response left, no quick assertion that could restore what had just been dismantled, and I let that silence sit, not filling it, not rushing it, because this was the part where reality settled in, where understanding turned into consequence, and the younger officer glanced toward the homes again, then back at the folder, then at Melissa, like he was realizing this was no longer just about one complaint. This was about an entire system that might not have been operating the way everyone believed it was. And Melissa finally spoke, her voice lower now, more careful. "You would not disrupt an entire community over a misunderstanding," she said. And there it was, not a statement, not an order, but an appeal, subtle but unmistakable. And I met her gaze steadily. "This is not a misunderstanding," I said, and I could see it land, not harsh, not aggressive, just clear, and the officer closed the folder again, holding it firmly now, no uncertainty left in his posture, and he looked at Melissa, then back at me. "If there are violations, this becomes a legal matter beyond HOA enforcement," he said, and that was the final shift, the point where this stopped being about neighborhood rules and started being about something much bigger. And Melissa's shoulders lowered just slightly, not in defeat, not yet, but in recognition that the ground she had been standing on was not as solid as she believed, and I could feel every eye on us still, waiting, watching, understanding that whatever came next would not just affect me, or her, but everyone here. And I took a slow breath, the heat pressing down, the stillness settling in, because this was where the story changed direction completely. And I knew she was finally starting to see it too. The weight of it settled slowly, not all at once, but in layers, like the heat pressing down from the sun, steady and unavoidable, and I could see it in every face around me. The officers, the neighbors, even Melissa, that quiet realization that nothing about this situation was going back to the way it was before, and I did not rush to fill the silence, because this was the part where everything had to land on its own, where understanding turned into something heavier, something real, and the officer finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "At this point, this is no longer a matter for HOA enforcement," he said, and that line drew a clear boundary, one that could not be crossed back over. and Melissa stood there, still composed on the surface, but the edges were gone now. The sharp certainty that had defined her earlier replaced by something more careful, more restrained, like she was choosing every movement, every word, with precision, and she glanced briefly at the houses around us, at the people watching, at the quiet audience that had witnessed the shift in real time. And when she looked back at me, there was no performance left in her expression, only calculation, only awareness. "This will require review," she said, slower now, measured, and I nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging what was already obvious, because this had moved beyond her control, beyond any single decision she could make in the moment, and the younger officer stepped back another pace, creating space without even realizing it, like the situation itself had grown larger than the physical distance between us, and I could hear the faint sound of someone closing a window somewhere down the street, the quiet click echoing just enough to remind everyone that this was no longer just a spectacle. It was something that would carry forward, something that would follow them after this moment ended, and I shifted my weight slightly, feeling the gravel settle under my boots, grounding, steady, because none of this had changed what I already knew. It had only made it visible, and I looked at Melissa one more time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. "Everything from here is going to be documented and reviewed against the lease," I said, and I kept my voice even, not raised, not forced, because the power in it was not in how it sounded, it was in what it meant. And she held my gaze for a second longer than before, as if trying to find something in it, some indication of how far this would go, some limit she could still rely on. But there was none to find, only the same calm, steady certainty that had been there from the beginning, and she exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, not in defeat, but in recognition, and the officer closed the folder completely this time, holding it at his side, no longer referencing it, because he did not need to. The facts were already established, and he nodded once, looking between us. "We are going to note this as a civil matter pending further legal review," he said, and that was it, the final shift from assumption to process, from confrontation to consequence. And the patrol car engines idled a little louder in the background now, like the moment was starting to release its grip, like time was beginning to move again after being held in place. And Melissa stepped back finally, just one step, small but significant, creating a space that had not existed before, and I watched as she adjusted her posture, not to regain control, but to adapt, to reposition herself in a situation she no longer defined. And the neighbors began to move as well, slowly at first, retreating from their silent observation, carrying with them the understanding that something fundamental had just shifted in the place they lived, something they would not be able to ignore going forward. And I stood there for another second, letting it all settle, the heat, the quiet, the weight of what had just been set in motion, because this was never about the moment itself, it was about everything that would follow it. And as the officers turned back toward their cars and the street began to breathe again, I knew one thing for certain: nothing in this neighborhood would feel the same after today.